thank Dr. Alon Burstein for coming and sharing some of his wisdom with us. Dr. Alon got his PhD from Hebrew University. He studies political science, but more specifically, he is an expert on regional terrorist groups surrounding the Middle East, how that affects Israeli politics. He is a scholar of Zionism. He teaches at UCI a class on Zionism, a class on different social movements around Israel, and classes on regional terrorism. So he is a good person in this intersection of the complexity of Israeli politics in terms of all the different factors that are going into, one, why Israel has had so many elections in the past couple of years, and also what might people be looking towards when they elect a new government. Alon is also, since he moved here with his wife Shauna, he also now has a 3-year-old, 4-month-old?
3 or 4 months.
A 3-month-old baby Aviv, who is at home. He's very cute. So thank you for leaving Aviv at home and being here with us. Although I'm sure he'd be just as excited to be a part of this conversation one day. Hopefully Israel will have figured out all the issues Professor Alon will bring up by the time Aviv is old enough to vote. Alon's also been a great friend to the Jewish community on campus. He's come to many Hillel events. Last Friday night, he talked to a group of, I think, 40, 45 students at my apartment about the Israeli election, and they were all very captivated, so I hope to continue the streak. So we're going to do about 30 to 40 minutes of Alon talking, describing the situation, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. So if you're in person, I'll walk around with a microphone, and if you're on YouTube or Zoom, feel free to type questions throughout the lecture into the class, and we'll make sure to get to them. Thank you, Professor Alon Burstein.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me and for setting up that apparently everyone's going to be captivated. But I will say that Aviv is, in fact, extremely cute. My 3-month-old at home. So, yes, it is an interesting learning curve becoming a parent. Okay, on that note, I also want to apologize for a technical issue. The pointer for me to switch the slides does not work from here. So I'm going to have to be signaling Daniel over there to switch the slides now and then. So we'll see how that goes. When Daniel asked me to come and talk about Israeli elections, I was puzzled because there's a lot to talk about. These are the 5th elections in 3.5 years. And when people keep on asking me what's going to happen, I say, I don't know, I'll tell you by the 6th election. So unfortunately, I'm not necessarily going to say this is how it's all going to be worked out. But I decided that maybe it would help to take us through a little bit of the history of Israeli parties, or at least party blocs, why it may have been easier in the past to form coalitions, why that system sort of broke down in the last couple of years, and what's happened in every one of these rounds. What has happened to lead us from election to election to election to election. That's where we are now. So see if you can switch slides. We'll work on it. We'll think about it. I'll wait. There we go. So just starting us off a little bit thinking about left-right in Israel, because around the world, the axis usually is between more socialist views, capitalist views, conservative, liberal. In Israel, you really have these various different axes. And the topics of left-right intersect with economics, but very often are not solely about economics. They're about security issues, about debates vis-a-vis the Palestinian territories, definitions of Israel as a Jewish or a democratic state. And flip me again. You thought you were going to go sit down. Historically, the map has been dominated for the first 50 years of the country by 2 parties. The Likud, which was a continuation of the Harut party on one side, and Ha'avodah, Labor, which was a continuation of the Mapai party on the other side. And coalitions seem to build around these 2 parties. But that system broke down. So, flip me again, this is why I said it's going to be, there we go. So just looking very, very briefly at some of the history. So in the first 30 years of the country, Israel was characterized really as what we call a dominant party system. There was one party, Mapai, which would later become Labor, led by Ben-Gurion initially, and every single election round, that party won a landslide. At one point, it had 56 seats in the Knesset. The Knesset has 120 seats, you need 61 for an absolute majority. Every single coalition, there was no challenger. There were obviously parties in the opposition, but the political map was dominated on one side, and there was never a real problem to form coalitions. Because one party, everyone knows who's going to lead the country, everyone knows that the prime minister is coming from that party, and it would collect small parties around it, form a coalition, and we're off. That system changed in 1977. In 1977, following a lot of historic things, which I would say I'm happy to talk about later, but I'll never stop talking about it, so if there's specific questions, we can ask later. In 1977, different historic shifts led to the rise of Likud under Menachem Begin. First time that the prime minister was not from the Mapai party. And you really started to have what's called a two-party system, but not like in the United States. We'll call it a two-cluster system, where the Likud on one side and Ha'avodah, Labor on the other side, were both very, very dominant parties. Between the two of them, they usually had about 80 seats. And then there were fringe parties around them. And the system shifted. Sometimes the coalitions were led by Labor. Sometimes coalitions were led by Likud. In the 1980s, we had unity governments, and we had the first time this transitory government where the two parties came together and agreed that the prime minister will be 2 years from this party, then 2 years from that party. But that would characterize the system. That broke in the early 2000s, primarily as a result of the failure of the Oslo Accords, the Labor-led attempt to finalize a treaty with the Palestinians, the two-state solution. When that collapsed in the Second Intifada, the Labor side, the camp opposing to Likud, was dealt a devastating blow. It was a devastating blow that it has never recovered from. And thus, since 2003, with the exception of 3 years, between 2003 and 2021, every coalition has been dominated by the Likud. There's never been a serious challenger. Nonetheless, we still call that a multi-party system because the Likud has never been as powerful as Mapai. Likud still gets about 30 seats, and it's always trying to form coalitions with a lot of fringe parties. And that is sort of very fertile ground for instability. When every time, in order to create a government, you need to pledge to a party that has 5 seats, okay, we'll make you minister of this, and a party that has 10 seats, okay, you come in also, we'll make you minister of that, the system starts to get shaky. And really, what led us to this point, that started in 2019, these rounds of elections, are when a new challenge came to the Likud government, and a new bloc started to form that is a lot less unified. And this new bloc is trying to challenge Netanyahu as a result of several different things. Switch me. As a result of several different things we're going to talk about. So between 2015 and 2019, there was a very stable Likud-led government. That government was known at the time as the most right-wing government in Israel. It passed a couple of laws that were very controversial. One of them was called the Arrangement Law that had to do with making certain settlements that were deemed illegal legal. Another one was called the Nationalism Law, which defined Israel as specifically a Jewish state, and there was a lot of controversy vis-a-vis the Arab citizens of Israel. And one of the things that started to make that coalition be more and more shaky was rumors that were starting to spread that the leader of the coalition, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, is being investigated by the police on several different counts. Gradually, throughout 2017, 2018, this started to come to the fold. At the end of 2018, the coalition falls. Lieberman, who leads a party called Israel-Palestine, resigned from the coalition as a result of a ceasefire that was signed between Israel and Hamas, and the country goes to elections. A couple of things happened at the beginning of 2019. First of all, Benny Gantz, who was before the chief of staff, and in Israel, chief of staff has a very big aura of respectability. The military, the army has a very respectable image, forms a party. he forms a party. He joins with Yair Lapid, who already had an established party, and they form Blue-White. Blue-White, much to everyone's surprise, in initial polls, is almost defeating the Likud, a party that was just created. Together, they are showing that the people want a change. 1. 2, in January 2019, the district attorney announces that Netanyahu is in fact going to be indicted pending a hearing. This also heavily shakes the system. And then, in April, Israel goes to the polls. Hit B. And these are the results. The Likud gets 35. Blue-White gets 35. And the camps, so to speak, are divided this way. There's a lot of controversy about how to define a camp, which party belongs in which camp. I'll just say a word on the way the Israeli system works. After the elections, the final results come out, and then each party goes to the president and recommends who do they think should be tasked, should be given the mandate to form a government. And the person who gets the most recommendations, or the person who the president deems has the best chance, is given the mandate. So when I divided these camps, I divided them according to who recommended who. So everyone on the Likud camp, all the parties recommended Netanyahu. They said Netanyahu should be the one who's tasked with forming a government. Everyone on the opposing camp, Blue-White, Labor, and Meretz, recommended Benny Gantz. The ones in the middle did not recommend anyone. They came and said, we don't recommend either of these. So I remind you, you need a 61 majority in order to form a government. So this creates a problem for the country. So Netanyahu is given the mandate. He tries to form a government, but much to many people's astonishment, Israel-Beitenu, Lieberman's party, with 5 seats, which is known historically to be very hawkishly right-wing, in the last minute refuses to go into the coalition. Lieberman says, and there's a lot of theories, and people made careers over writing about what Lieberman's thinking, but his main argument is he would not go into the coalition with the ultra-Orthodox parties because he demands a change in the system that ultra-Orthodox boys be drafted to the military, which in Israel they're exempt, which is a lot of controversy. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot of information. I know I'm throwing out a lot of information, and I'm happy to talk about it in question period later. And yes, I found that funny too. Then, according to the law, what's supposed to happen if the person who received a mandate from the president fails to form a government, that person is supposed to go back to the president and very ceremonially say, I have failed. I have failed. Please task someone else. But something happens for the first time in Israel's history, which is, even though Netanyahu failed to create a government, there were still enough people who either followed the Likud in the Knesset, or enough people who are simply against these results, and they came together and voted that the Knesset disband itself. So rather than someone else being tasked to form a government, the Knesset, after 45 days, voted to disband itself and go to another elections. The first time in history. An important anecdote that did not seem so important in Israel's history until this started. The previous prime minister and the previous government all stay in power until a new government is formed. And in Israel, when elections are called, also very rare compared to the rest of the world, you do not have elections as fast as possible. In fact, the law says that elections will be at least 90 days after the Knesset disbands. So you have at least 3 months, usually more, usually 4 to 5 months between when they declare elections and elections happen. During this time, the previous prime minister and the previous government are still in power. And what the Likud and Netanyahu discovered was a wonderful loophole here. because he was in power at the end of 2018. Then elections occurred. He was given the mandate, but instead of giving the mandate back to someone else to possibly form a government, they simply overthrew the Knesset, go to another elections, and he continued to be in power until the next elections. Which bring us to the next elections. Hit me. We're all in suspense. Elections to the 22nd Knesset. So we had a second round of elections in 2019, this time in September. And what do you know? The results didn't change drastically. The Likud receives 32, Blue-White receives 33. The Likud camp comes up to about 55. Something interesting happened in the opposing camp. Israel has, since the 1980s, between 3 to 4 parties that are often called colloquially as Arab parties, Arab-Israeli parties. 4 different parties, each one slightly different than the other one, that tend to get into the Knesset, that are almost entirely dominated by Arab Israelis, and who the majority of Arab Israelis tend to vote for them. Historically, they have never gone into a government until now. They've never even recommended anyone to be prime minister. They always would come up and say, we don't believe in this system, we don't believe in how the state runs, we're not a part of this. For the first time, in September 2019, 3 out of the 4 parties in what's called the Joint Arab List recommended that Benny Gantz be given the mandate. So all of a sudden, the opposing camp gets a big boost in the amount of people who are supporting it, at least. However, Netanyahu received more recommendations. And so the president tasks Netanyahu with the mandate, not before getting from him a guarantee that if he fails, he will not overthrow the Knesset. That if he fails, the mandate will come back to the president to task someone else. Netanyahu receives the mandate and starts the process. And also this, everything in Israel is very lengthy. 30 days, 28 days is the mandate, and you can get an extension of another 2 weeks. So again, if you're building on being an interim prime minister, already you've bought yourself another month and a half. Netanyahu has the mandate for that time. During this time, he's officially indicted. He's officially indicted in 3 different cases, 2 of them for fraud, violation of trust, breach of trust, things like that. 1 of them for bribery. He's still in court. We can talk about the cases. Again, classes and books are written about these cases, and I'm not a legal scholar. I'm happy to share what I know about them later, which is not all the technical details. However, his indictment starts to shake the system even more, as different parties who may have swung previously, such as Israel-Palestine, start to say, we will not sit under a prime minister who is in court. Another small anecdote about the Israeli case, the Israeli system. In Israel, ministers who are under indictment are required to resign. So if you are Minister of Finance, Minister of Defense, Minister of Health, all these are ministers who fell under indictment at different times in Israel's history, you're required by law to resign. The law, however, does not stipulate that a prime minister has to resign. So you cannot be a minister. You cannot have your portfolio. You cannot be Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade. But the law does not say that you cannot be prime minister. Netanyahu is indicted. He tries to form a government, but Israel-Palestine, again, Lieberman's party, says we will not join what's called a narrow government, a government that just passes the threshold of 61-62. If you want us in the government, Likud and Blue-White has to come together with us, and we're happy to be in the government. So Netanyahu fails, and the mandate is passed over to Benny Gantz. But wouldn't you know, Benny Gantz tries to form a government, and Lieberman and Israel-Palestine says, we will not join a narrow government. We wouldn't join the Likud, we won't join you. If you're interested in us being in your government, by all means, you have to form a deal with the other side. And both sides are refusing to form deals with each other. Benny Gantz and his party, which was at the time made up of 3 different parties. In Israel, it's a list system, party system. Again, I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can, so I apologize wherever I fail. His party list was made up of 3 different parties. He said, we will not sit with a prime minister under indictment. So no deal from our side. And the Likud under Netanyahu was saying, we will not be dethroned in this way, not to mention, as long as the situation continues as it is, Netanyahu is still prime minister. And the system is still continuing. After Gantz fails, according to the law, the mandate goes to the Knesset. It goes to the parliament. And there are 3 weeks when anyone from the Knesset has the mandate. Anyone who can gather 61 people can go to the president and say, here I am, I'm prime minister now. Wouldn't you know? No one does. No one manages. So therefore, automatically, after those 3 weeks, the law says it will be seen as though the Knesset overthrew itself. If after 2 people are given the mandate to form a government, and then it goes to the Knesset, and the Knesset still cannot form a government, it will be seen as though the Knesset has decided this party system doesn't work, and we go to another election. Thus, we get to round number 3. Round number 3 occurs in March. Sorry, these pages are folding up. Occurs in March of 2020. And here some things change. Because after Netanyahu has been indicted, and after, by now, he is prime minister for well over a year without ever being voted into power as prime minister. He's continuing to be interim prime minister since the government fell in December 2018. We're now in March 2020. By now, different parties who have nothing in common are coming together to throw their weight to the other side. So all of a sudden, there's no one in the middle. The Likud camp still has its traditional Likud, Shas, and United Torah Judaism are the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and Yamina, at the time, was a new party that was, again, at the time, the most hawkish right-wing party. They all threw their weight behind Netanyahu, but all of a sudden, the opposing camp is joined by Israel-Palestine. Lieberman throws his weight behind Benny Gantz, says, you know what? This is the person who should be prime minister. Enough's enough. And for the first time, the entire joint Arab list, including parties that say they will not sit in a government because they will not recognize the validity of the Zionist entity, they still throw their weight and say, enough is enough with Netanyahu's government. And all of a sudden, the opposing camp has 62. I remind you, in order to form a government, you need 61. However, while they all agree that they won't have Netanyahu, that doesn't mean they all actually agree to form a coalition. That does not mean they all actually agree that they're going to sit together. But what they did start to do is try to enact a couple of moves that would be detrimental for Netanyahu. Because they now have a majority in the Knesset that's working together, they started to push for several laws in this interim period. One that would say a prime minister under indictment or a person under indictment cannot be given the mandate to form a government. The second was to impose term limits in Israel. Israel does not have any term limits. It's another controversial topic, happy to talk about later. more from the political scientists and me screaming, there's more to say there. Israel does not have term limits. They start to move to impose these laws, and that starts to mount a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. The system is getting shaky. It can't just continue to bounce from election to election. Moreover, something else was happening in the world in February, March of 2020. Heard of this COVID thing. So at that time, when it seemed like the world was ending, and it seemed like this new pandemic was taking over the world, no one knew what was happening, all sides, Netanyahu because of these changes and because of the pandemic, Benny Gantz because of the looming pandemic, they said, okay, enough with the game, we need a functioning government. One of the reasons that there was a lot of pressure was because the government was going from election to election. The country had not passed a budget since the beginning of 2018. Because if you're constantly in election periods, you're actually not allowed to pass a budget because you're determining what the next government is going to do. And so the budget was still operating on 2018 parameters, and with the impending pandemic, they realized something has to change. So then, Benny Gantz starts to enter into negotiations with Netanyahu against the screaming objections of members of his own party. And hit me. And what we see is the parties split. So from blue-white, that had 33 seats, it all of a sudden splits into its 3 different parties. So Benny Gantz now leads a party called Chosen Israel with 13 seats. Yair Lapid, his Yesh Atid party, splits to 18 seats. And Derech Eretz was created then, but it doesn't matter. There was a third party then within the list that has 2 seats. We also see a split in the Labor Party. Labor ran along with 2 different parties, Gesher and Meretz. They also split as a result of this because different elements are saying we can't play the game anymore. Pandemic is coming, we can't play the game. So Labor is saying we need to form a government no matter what. Whereas Meretz and Gesher, well, Gesher is a different story, but Meretz is saying, no, we will not sit with Netanyahu. We stand by. Pandemic, no pandemic. We will not sit with Netanyahu. And Yamina also splits. But then there comes a question. How do we form a coalition? The sides still hate each other. Benny Gantz says, I'll be prime minister. You can be my deputy. Netanyahu says, excuse me, I have the most amount of seats. I'll be prime minister. You can be my deputy. And the president, again, within this atmosphere of COVID and you just have to do everything you can right now, proposes changing the Israel does not have a constitution, but what's called the constitutional arrangements. And they come up with a term, alternative prime minister. They change the what's called basic law government of how you form a government to say you're no longer going to have just a prime minister. You're going to have a prime minister. You're going to have an alternative prime minister. Within this system, what you will have is 2 different camps coming together to form an equal government. And importantly, it does not matter which one of those camps has a majority in the government. They each have veto power. Right? Because if both sides don't trust each other, so the idea is they will be a check and balance on each other. Right? If I want to be prime minister and Rabbi Daniel is my vocal opposition, as he often is, to be fair. And someone's trying to say, okay, but you need to form a government now. Okay, it doesn't matter that I have 15 seats behind me and he has 30. I will say, no problem, but I'm not going to be a minority in this government. So it doesn't matter how many seats I have. We have equal power. We have equal power. We have equal veto power. And again, I'm happy to talk more about the alternative prime minister because it's created a lot of problems in Israel. But the idea is, in brief, that 2 blocs will come together. They will each nominate who is their prime minister and alternative prime minister, and there will be a trade-off. The prime minister will be prime minister for a certain amount of time, and the alternative prime minister will then become prime minister and they'll switch. Hit me? And this is the coalition that they form. In green are the parties that come in on Netanyahu's side. So there's Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, Yamina split, importantly for the future. Yamina split, and only the Jewish home was willing to go in. And Gesher, doesn't matter, from labor. They took one from the other side. And in turn, from Benny Gantz's side, Chosen Israel, Derech Eretz, and labor. Like I said, the numbers in this case don't matter. Because the deal is, Netanyahu will be prime minister for a year and a half. Benny Gantz will then be prime minister for a year and a half. In the meanwhile, each side has veto power. You cannot, in government, pass a motion without the other side's complete agreement. Yes, this is not a system that makes a lot of sense. I try to shield my political opinion on a lot of things. I cannot do it on the alternative prime minister scheme. And I'm happy to talk about it later. However, one thing I will say about it, because there was such mistrust, because each side knew that the other side was only going into this in order to try to screw the other side over, in order to try to figure out a way to make sure that I will become prime minister and the other side is split and the other side is this and the other side is that, they tried to add in every possible check and balance to say, if someone from your side overthrows the government, I'm automatically prime minister. Right? So even though, right, because in Daniel and my coalition, even though he has a majority, right? So technically, he could just decide on a rule, I have veto power, okay, but he's still deciding to overthrow the Knesset. He's still deciding to have a vote of no confidence. He's still deciding for something. Okay, the law says if you overthrow the government, I become prime minister automatically for the interim period. However, the one thing that all these little checks and balances did not take into account is what happens if you get to the very rare instance where the Knesset automatically disbands itself. There are rare instances that the Knesset automatically disbands, and one of them is if the government, once a coalition is formed, fails to pass a budget. So a budget was not passed since January or March 2018. Then they had interim governments. They formed this coalition. The law says you have to pass a budget within 3 months. Otherwise, it is seen as automatically the government falls. The Likud proposes to blue-white, we don't need to rush this. Let's pass a law saying that the budget can be passed later. So they postponed the budget from August till November. Then the Likud says, well, the deal was that we pass a budget for 2 years, so that by definition the government will not be overthrown next year. But let's just pass it for 1 year. And at that point, Benny Gantz realizes the following year's budget is not going to be passed, and the Knesset will automatically disband. So Gantz pulls out of the coalition in December of 2020. The coalition falls apart. The Knesset automatically disbands because it has no budget. And thus we get to round 4. March 2021. So what has happened in the meanwhile? Throughout the previous year, during the Gantz-Netanyahu government, there began to be massive social uproar over the political system. It was becoming increasingly cynical, and specifically the idea that the prime minister is under indictment and appearing in court many days of the week started to bring up massive weekly protests on scales rarely seen in Israel. Every Saturday night, blocking traffic throughout all of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, If you lived there, no matter whose side you are, it was not fun to try to get from point A to point B in the city. Tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people protesting every week, saying this has just become a completely corrupt system. So that's one of the things that are in the background here. A second thing that happened leading up to these elections, which was very important, was that there were continuous splits in the parties as a result of the previous elections, right? We saw already blue-white had split, and Labor and Meretz had split. But one of the things that also happened is there was a split in the Joint Arab list. So this list that used to be made up of 4 parties was now made up of 3 parties. And Ram decided to run by itself. And finally, leading up to the elections, you started to have more and more contenders saying, you know what? I'm running for prime minister. Because this system isn't working, right? Historically in Israel, the biggest party leads a coalition, becomes prime minister. I won't say everyone's happy. Sometimes a lot of people aren't happy, but that's still what happens. Ends relative stability. In this case, the biggest party was Likud. Everyone's getting increasingly cynical about it. The second biggest party had split, and a lot of people were angry at Benny Gantz for merging or forming a coalition with the Likud. And you start to have more and more contenders saying, you know what? It doesn't matter that I'm a small party. I'm the only one who can actually bridge this gap. I'm the only one who might be able to bring forth a coalition. So, elections happen, and these are the results. The Likud camp with 52. It's usual, Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and this time a party that was rebranded as religious Zionism. The opposing camp had lost some people, so to speak, because Yesh Atid now has 17, that's Yair Lapid's party. Blue-White, that's Benny Gantz's party, rebranded and called himself Blue-White, has 8, Israel-Palestine 7, Labor and Meretz. But meanwhile, Yamina, a party that was perceived as quite right-wing, said, we're not in Netanyahu's camp anymore. Yamina goes to the president and says, we recommend the leader of Yamina, Naftali Bennett, as prime minister. A New Hope, a party that was set up by Gidon Sa'ar, someone who was chased out of the Likud practically, goes to the president and says, we recommend no one. No one here is fit. And the Joint Arab List and Ram, again, go and recommend no one. So, Netanyahu is given the mandate because he has the most people recommending him. However, he fails. He fails because, once again, we don't have any winning coalition. Then Yair Lapid is given the mandate. And Lapid tries very hard to form a government under him. And eventually, much to everyone's surprise, you end up with a deal being brokered between Yesh Atid under Lapid with 17 seats and Yamina of Naftali Bennett, who, even though it says 7, they really brought 6 seats because one of their people defected. And that deal goes as follows. You remember that term, alternative prime minister? Okay. Let's make a deal. I have, if I'm Bennett, I have X amount of people, certainly not a winning coalition, but X amount of people who are willing to come to government under me, even though I only have 7 seats. I can't have a coalition with that. It's not 61. Yesh Atid. I have X amount of people, also not 61. Let's come together under this prime minister, alternative prime minister scheme, with Bennett going first as prime minister for 2 years with his camp, and then we'll switch. And Lapid is prime minister. But really, the impetus was to say, we need to get Netanyahu out. The impetus was to say Netanyahu has been in power by now consecutively since 2009. And no matter how many election rounds are occurring, the Likud is by far still the biggest party. And the only way that he's going to be deposed is if these very strange bedfellows come together. And so, hit me. We're in suspense. This is the party that is the coalition that is formed. On Yamina's side, so the right-wing side, there is Yamina, A New Hope, and Israel-Palestine. The parties that represent the right. Right? Together, even if we count Yamina as 7, right, we're looking at 20 seats. Right? So not a winning coalition, but because of the Prime Minister, alternative Prime Minister, the numbers don't matter. If this is my camp, that means I have a blocking coalition in the government. And on the Yesh Atid side, we have Yesh Atid, Blue-White, Meretz, and for the first time in Israel's history, Ra'am. For the first time in Israel's history, an Arab-Israeli party joins the coalition. Ra'am was a very interesting story because Netanyahu actually tried desperately to get Ra'am to join his coalition when he had the mandate. He tried to promise all kinds of things to Arab Israelis just for Ra'am to make up the missing seats and form a coalition. However, the religious Zionist party said, if they're in, we're out. And thus he couldn't do it. And this government was then called the change government. It was a government that was meant to bring change. It was changing Netanyahu in power. It was going to end corruption. It was going to do a lot of things. The only real problem with this plan is that none of these parties agree with each other. Right? You have Ra'am, who actually is a party of the Southern Islamic movement in Israel, Meretz, which is historically the what's called most left Zionist party, and Labor, all pulling towards more left-wing agendas, more socialism, trying to find accommodations with the Palestinians, etc. On the other side, you have Yamina, a party whose campaign pledge was to annex the West Bank. To annex the West Bank and not give Palestinians any rights. You have A New Hope, a party that, in its mandate, will aspire for free market capitalism. All sitting together in the coalition and all having veto power over the other side. So measuring this coalition, success or failure. If their mission was to end the consecutive Netanyahu staying in power through interim government to interim government, they deem it a success. And a lot of people who were out protesting that a prime minister in indictment should not be in power consider it a success. In their attempt to bring forth a lot of other change, no matter which camp you're in, you tend to be disappointed. Because the left could not promote a lot of agendas, the right could not promote a lot of agendas. Critically, their coalition, I don't actually have the total up here, which is a mistake on my part, their coalition formed 61. That is a very thin majority in a parliament of 120. Which means that from day one, the coalition was primarily putting out fires. It was primarily putting out fires with this member of Meretz that said, you know what, I'm sick of what Yamina is doing, I'm not voting for the coalition now. And then this member of Yamina saying, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. And constantly making deals, trying to figure out how to keep the coalition alive. What is interesting, though, is that between the leaders of the coalition, between Bennett and Lapid, and sort of the leaders after them, Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar, there was seemingly amazing trust. Now, a lot of theories have been written by about this due to the fact that throughout all of the four's careers, they were all backstabbed by Netanyahu. So they had one common ground to trust each other. But other than that, they tended to work very well together. However, within months, the system started to get too shaky. And the final sort of straw that broke this coalition was laws that were expiring that permit Israel to carry on its current regime in the West Bank. Right, so the West Bank, again, not going to get into it now, happy to talk about it later for hours on end. But within the West Bank, an area that's not annexed by Israel and is officially under martial law, however, extensions of Israeli authority are enforced there, specifically within the settlements, but this is a law that has to be renewed every so often. And all of a sudden, this coalition could not do that because Ram, Meretz, and elements of labor said, we're not voting for that. We don't agree to this, no matter what happens. And the leaders of the coalition tried to go to the Likud and say, look, you may be against our government, but you agree that these laws need to pass. This is a right-wing agenda. But the Likud and religious Zionism said, no, that's kind of your problem to figure that one out. And so Bennett and Lapid actually came to an agreement on how the coalition is going to disband. And they agreed that Bennett would vote against the coalition, by definition the coalition falling apart, so that Lapid becomes prime minister for the interim period. And thus, in June of 2022, and there's a reason it was June 30th, because the laws expired on June 31st, those laws. July 1st. Fair. I should have just said the next day. That would have been smoother. I grant. Okay. Should have just said the next day. The laws expire the next day at the end of June. And thus, on June 30th, they broke apart the coalition because in Israeli law, if a government falls and you're in an interim period, every law that's expiring automatically continues until the next government is formed. And thus, we get to this week, round 5. What I bring here are the averages of the different polls and what they're showing. And that's why there's ranges for each one. And I will say, I sent this PowerPoint, I think, 2 days ago. There's already some updates. The latest poll, Likud gets 30. But again, these are polls. They can be wildly inaccurate. Likud gets 30. Yesh Atid, I have there on 27. Religious Zionism gets 15. However, if we look at what these polls are currently showing, what we are seeing is not a big change. We're seeing the Likud camp, that is, parties that have pledged to only go with the Likud, between 58 and 60. In turn, we're seeing the anti-Netanyahu camp, is what I call it. Because this camp has openly said, if the Likud would be so kind as to depose Netanyahu as leader, we're happy to go with the Likud. Many members of this camp, Yesh Atid, the status camp, Israel-Palestine, they're happy to go with the Likud. They just won't sit with Netanyahu. They are between 57 and 61, which sounds like a potential coalition. However, yet again, you have Israel-Palestine, who's not going to sit with a lot of other parties there. You have the Joint Arab List. Well, the Joint Arab List. Oh, right. They're running as Hadash Tal. Sorry, they split again. So the one above Ram, Hadash Tal, is a remnant of the Joint Arab List. They're not going to sit in this coalition together. They're just in the anti-other coalition camp. And Meanwhile, critically, you have a couple of parties that are beneath the threshold, which means they're going to get votes but may not get in. And the two most important ones are Balad and a Jewish Home. Balad is one of the Arab-Israeli parties. Like I said, the joint Arab list split, so they are running on their own. And if they don't get in, that is going to be several good thousand votes on the anti-Netanyahu camp that basically get lost. But in turn, the Jewish Home, who is Ayelet Shaked's new party, has pledged to be in Netanyahu's camp, also right now not passing a threshold. So equally, several good thousand votes likely to get lost. So this is the way the current map looks. So, like I said, I don't end on an optimistic note. But if we just look at the process that sort of developed in the last couple of years, first of all, we saw a breakdown of the traditional ideological blocks, right? If we came from the Mapai Labor and Cherut Likud, and each one of them represented their camp, we see, first of all, that the system has become entirely personal. It is entirely about pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu. One thing. Another symptom of the breakdown of ideologies we're seeing for the first time. Parties that have nothing to do with one another and staunchly against each other and call each other fascists in their campaigns, sitting together, passing each other's laws, all because of seemingly a common enemy. Seemingly, but we need to keep Netanyahu out, so Israel-Palestine will sit with Ram. Israel-Palestine is a party that has historically said that Arab Israelis should be kicked out of Israel. And they are sitting with Ram, representing Arab Israelis passing laws within the coalition. We're also seeing the fragility of this. We're also seeing how these coalitions don't tend to last. And finally, one of the critical things that we're seeing, mentioning Ram, is the entrance of Arab-Israeli parties into a more dominant role in Israeli politics. And that is likely in the future to be a big game changer. Because especially since the 2000s and the fall of Oslo, the left has never been able to form an actual left-wing bloc because traditionally 10 to 15 seats are Arab-Israeli parties that are just not a part of the coalition. They're not considered a part of the coalition, and they reject being part of the coalition. But Ram broke that taboo, and one of the reasons that Hadash-Ta'al split from Balad was because Balad was saying, we will run together only if you pledge not to go into any government. Hadash-Ta'al said no, which again is a break from their history. So I don't know where we're going. My wife is very upset that we're not there to vote. I told her I promise we'll be there for the next round. And that is sort of taking us through on that very non-optimistic note, and I'm happy to talk about anything and everything related to that. Later.
I understand from what I'm reading that minimum number of votes to get at least one Knesset member, since it was raised to 3.2% from 2%, that was a part of this, and that if we actually go down back to 2% or even lower, that may improve the process.
Historically, Israel has one of the lowest threshold of parliamentary systems. A lot of systems have 5 to 10% of the vote as a threshold. The reason for that, or the reason to have a higher threshold, is that cuts out fringe parties. It cuts out parties that are going to get just 1 seat or 2 seats. It says you have to centralize, coming a little bit more to the two-party system in the United States, where it's not worth it to run a small party. You're not going to pass any threshold. Israel started to raise the threshold very, very gradually years ago. 2015 was the latest big jump from 2% to 3.25, which amounts to 4 seats in the Knesset. That was done by Israel Beitenu with a ploy to lock Arab-Israeli parties out. They were only getting 3 seats, as they said, let's raise the threshold so they'll be locked out. The result of that was that they joined together, created the joint Arab list, and became the 3rd biggest party. So that heavily backfired. There is some push to lower the threshold again. In the current climate, I'm not sure I would agree that it will solve anything, because what you're going to end up having is parties with 1 seat or 2 seats that can then say, oh, you have a 60 block of coalition, you need me. Great. I'll be alternative prime minister. Even though I'm just 1, but you need me. Right? So you're increasing more and more people who will have that like final say. So that's why often people are saying actually raise the threshold so that you only have big parties. I don't necessarily agree with that either, because you're going to end up erasing a lot of small parties. But it is a question. It will definitely have an effect.
Question, you said that you and your wife were talking, you were not going to be able to vote in this election. Can you explain why?
Yes, she would be very happy to find me guilty here for us being here. There is no absentee voting in Israel. You cannot vote if you're out of the country unless you are on a diplomatic mission or are part of other governmental missions. So there's a lot of, for example, emissaries to Hillel, who, because that's state-funded, they can still vote in the embassy. Otherwise, you have to be physically present on that day to vote. And like Daniel said, I have a 3.5-month-old, and we did not get his passport in time. So, I suggested we could leave him and go vote. No one agreed with me. Yes, military who's stationed out can vote, any diplomatic mission, anything that's state-oriented. So if you're on a mission from something that the state is funding, if you are a rabbi and you're an emissary to World Congress, I don't know, I'm sure there are things like that, or things like that, then you can vote in every consulate, every embassy. But just citizens, no, you can't vote absentee. Doesn't matter, embassy, consulate. You have to be there physically present in your polling station.
It sounds from what you said that you've added now a 3rd sort of axis to this differentiation between party, left, right, secular, religious, and now you've got Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu. I imagine people have suggested it, but is there any reason you can think of why Netanyahu doesn't say, I'll take one for the team and get out of there so at least he can get his party back in power?
And I promise to try to not be cynical. So, it's difficult to say, why didn't someone just give up power? But I will say this, that there are a lot of countries in which the leader of the executive, be it president or prime minister, is exempt from indictment while they're in power. There are a lot of countries in which you have a lot of influence on the Supreme Court when you're in power. And why I say there are a lot of countries like that, because while Israel does not have that, religious Zionism, which is polling as the 3rd biggest party and is in Netanyahu's camp, last week put forth their plan to reform the justice system. Among their plans is invalidating the charge of breach of trust and invalidating the charge of another form of breach of trust. Breach of trust and an allegation of mismanaging your position, which are 2 out of the 3 indictments Netanyahu is under. So they say, well, of course, Netanyahu, we're not doing this for Netanyahu, obviously. However, the law does say if you are charged with something and that charge then, and the crime is then invalidated by the Knesset, your charges are dropped. They also, in their system of reform, put forth what's called the French law, because it's modeled after the French system, which says that the leader of the executive cannot be indicted unless on charges of murder, rape, or something else while he's in power. So Netanyahu's aspiration to stay in power may have, try not to be cynical, may have what to do with his ongoing trial. And some would probably argue that he also truly believes that he's the right person to lead the country, that in not every election, but most of the elections, even in the last 3 years, and certainly in the last 15 years, parties under his leadership have received landslide majorities, and therefore, he should be the one who is leading. That's as least cynical as I can be. When the mic is off and the cameras are off, I'll say other things.
Thank you for the great talk. I had a question about basically what Gideon Sa'ar is up to these days. I remember back when the most recent government fell, he said basically that the collaboration with Arab parties was a failure. So I'm wondering, since I didn't see New Hope on the latest chart, is he part of the status camp still, or is he just decided to just follow Bennett out of politics, or has he decided to mend fences with Netanyahu?
So Gideon Sa'ar was a leading member of the Likud party. And like many other leading members of the Likud party, ended up falling in Netanyahu's sights. It was chased out of the party when he tried to challenge Netanyahu's leadership. So in the latest primaries, there was only one contender against Netanyahu, Gideon Sa'ar. Everyone else says, we're not running against Netanyahu. Netanyahu is our man. He's our leader. And this primaries that occurred already like 2 years ago, I believe. And so he split off and formed a New Hope party. As the question stated, where he falls on this axis is questionable. On the one hand, he is staunchly anti-Netanyahu. However, his ideology is completely the same as the Likud. He joined with Benny Gantz. They merged parties to create the Statist Party. That's my own translation. It's called the Reshima Mamlachtit. Mamlachtiyut is a concept in Israel's history. It means like kinglihood, but really it means like being a part of the state. It's a concept that dates back to Ben Gurion saying you have to be mamlachti, which means like almost like presidential. You have to be presidential. You have to be a part of the state. You have to be of good character. So they called their list the Shema Mamlachtit. I actually spoke to a reporter who says all reporters in English are grinding their teeth. How do you translate that? So I went with the statist camp. So once again, we have Benny Gantz with blue-white in cahoots with another party, A New Hope, running under the statist camp. They have not mended fences with Netanyahu. However, they are saying that as far as they're concerned, Benny Gantz is the only person, even though he's polling at between 10 and 12, really, he's the only person who's going to be able to form a government. Because members of the Likud may go with him, the Orthodox parties may go with him, Labor may go with him. So, but that's where Gideon Sa'ar is specifically.
We have a question from online. Who is Itamar Ben-Gvir and why are we hearing so much about him?
So Itamar Ben-Gvir is the leader of a party that is called Jewish Power. He is a disciple of the Kahanist movement. Ben-Gvir, for 30-odd years already, has been, as far as he's concerned, fighting the good fight. He led many of the protests against Rabin at the time, before Rabin was assassinated. He is one of the most radical elements within Israeli politics. He calls for summary executions of Palestinians if they're caught throwing stones. He and his party, or elements within his party, have called for the outlawing of homosexuality in Israel. He, for years, has been on the fringe of the fringe. However, as the election rounds continued to build up, and as Netanyahu started to see that his ground is more shaky, he convinced different elements of other parties, most nominally the religious Zionist party, Bezalel Smotrich, another party that has similar views, convinced him to join with Jewish Home to not lose votes because they were polling beneath the threshold. So right now, he is number 2 on the Religious Zionist Party, and his party, the Jewish Home, has half of the seats in the Religious Zionist movement. And one of the reasons that he is making so much news is because he is extremely radical. For years, even elements on the far right said, we'll take everyone except for Ben Gvir. He, like I said, he's right now number 2. He has said that they will only go into government if he is made Minister of Defense or Minister of Interior Defense. And in previous elections, Netanyahu would always laugh off and say Ben Gvir will never be a minister. Lately in the Likud, they're saying we don't understand the problem with that. Why would there be a problem for him to be a minister? Another anecdote, Itamar Ben Gvir is the only member of the Knesset who has ever been indicted and found guilty of supporting terrorism. Because when he was younger, in the 90s, he was a member of violent Kahanist movements who were carrying out terror operations against Palestinians, and part of the group that was part of the incitement against Rabin. So he is number 2 in the Religious Zionist Party. He has been a member of the Knesset now for a few years and is sure to be a member of the Knesset after this election, but what his position will be will depend on who forms the government. Again,
in terms of wider checks and balances, just thinking about if such a thing were to happen in America, eventually it would go to the Supreme Courts and they'd use the Constitution and pass courts to move forward. Israel famously has no constitution. They do have a Supreme Court. So how does the Supreme Court play any role in any of the setup?
Any of the setup being like forming
the Supreme
coalitions?
Court come in and basically say the system doesn't work. We are voting as a court to change it, as opposed to having it internally try to change.
As Daniel said, Israel does not have a constitution. Israel has what's called basic laws. Long story about what the history of basic laws are, but what they're supposed to be are laws that will eventually come together to be a constitution. However, in the 1990s, the Supreme Court started to throw out other Knesset actions if they violated the basic laws. So famously, there's basic law, human dignity and freedom. And the Supreme Court often will say, even though the military is saying that has to do this in the West Bank or in Gaza, this violates the basic law that we view as a constitution. That said, there is actually no violation of the law in anything that has happened in the last 4 elections. Even the unprecedented idea that the Knesset will overthrow itself rather than letting someone other than Netanyahu become prime minister was within the bounds of the law. So the Supreme Court cannot enforce that. Where the Supreme Court can come in is when the laws themselves are changed. And that is why, for example, when there was basic law, prime minister was changed in order to allow for this concept of alternative prime minister. The Supreme Court weighed in. It did not throw out the law, but one of the things that was said was, due to the uniqueness and the extremism of the time, of COVID, of this political failure, we're allowing this even though it deviates by far from what should be done within the parameters of basic law. So the Supreme Court can weigh in, but there's no law that's been violated for the Supreme Court to actually come and say, no, you can't do this. Yes, you have that microphone.
You said religious Zionism. That's the guy, the extremist that was from the Khan.
That's led by Bezalel Smotrich is number 1, and Itamar Ben Gvir is number 2.
From Khan's.
Yeah, Kahana. Yeah.
Khan assassinated Rabin, so he's extremely
Extreme.
Yeah, and also a lot of his, from what I read, a lot of his agenda is not legal. He said he wants to change the Supreme Court. So that's very, very dangerous. And he's second in Likud.
In the religious Zionism party.
Yeah, and Israel can. I don't think Israel's going to destroy themselves if that's happened. That's my opinion.
Fortunately, that was not a question, so I don't have to answer if it's going to destroy itself or not. Thank you for making that a statement.
No, I just wanted to make sure if his second got 12 and 14.
Yes, so Bezalel Smotrich is the leader of the party, and in Israel, typically, the party leader is the one that gets all the floor. Right? Benny Gantz gets all the floor. I imagine most people here have heard of Benny Gantz. Does anyone know who number 2 in his party is? I don't know who number 2 in the Likud is. Anyone know? In Israel, the same would go in Israel, by the way. Like no one knows who number 2 and the rest are, usually, except in these coalitions of parties. Because then you have 2 party leaders coming together to form a coalition of one party, like blue-white, which was then, okay, that was Benny Gantz and Yesh Atid of Yair Lapid coming together, okay, so it's Gantz and Lapid. In religious Zionism, it's a similar thing. Bezalel Smotrich is number 1. So in theory, he's the party leader. He's the one who should be getting all the center stage. However, number 2 is Itamar Ben-Gvir. So, a couple of things. He himself, I harbor no love for him. He himself did not assassinate Rabin, and neither did Kahana. The member of different Kahanist movements who assassinated Rabin was Gal Amir. I mean, these things end up being important legally. That's why I'm like a sticker to the nuance. Do I think it matters for his character? No. But it's important for the nuance. He has a picture in his office of Kahana. Kahana, just small reminder, leader in 1984, he founded originally the Jewish Defense League in the United States, and then moved to Israel, ran a very extreme party that they had done all kinds of studies and showed that his party platform mimicked the Nuremberg laws of Germany, of Nazi Germany, except that he replaced the word Jew with the word Arab. Among his charming anecdotes was suggesting that Arabs have to be stripped of citizenship, was suggesting all kinds of things. So to be a Kahanist basically means you're a disciple of this movement. So he has a picture of Meir Kahana in his office in the Knesset. A lot of what he's suggesting, yes, is illegal. However, the argument that is made is right. But if the people vote this into power, maybe it shouldn't be illegal. Maybe it should be legal. In a country without a constitution, it's very problematic to end up saying, well, what you're suggesting is illegal, and even if the legislative passes a law to say that's legal, it's still illegal. It's not really, because there is no constitution that stands above whatever the legislative passes. I agree with you. It's insanely dangerous and not a good sign for the future. Regardless, even if he does not get into power, the fact that such forces are being legitimized in the country, again, if we look at Netanyahu's history, the fact that not 2 years ago, in order to encourage voters to vote for him, he said, don't worry, I will never make Ben-Gvir a minister in my government. And now, 2 years later, he is saying, I don't see the problem with making Ben-Gvir Minister of Defense. That's a dangerous trend. I agree. But again, thank you for making the statement about Israel destroying itself, so I don't have to say if that's what's going to happen or not.
So I have a comment. I just want everyone here to remember how important it was in the United States in the forming of our country that we had someone who voluntarily stepped down after 2 4-year terms, and that was George Washington. And if that hadn't happened, who knows what would have happened to this great country. So Netanyahu, I'd love to see him do a George Washington and just step down.
Any other questions?
Daniel on his toes.
I was just talking to my husband about why isn't there a constitution in Israel? Why is it taking so long? It's like glacial time. And if they did have a constitution, many of these problems may be solved. I don't know. What do you think?
Short answer, yes, they will be solved. Will there be a constitution in the foreseeable future or future at all? I doubt. And the reason is, when Israel was established, the first Knesset was established with the sole purpose of creating a constitution. That was its purpose. It was not set up to be a parliament. It was set up to be an interim parliament that would develop a constitution, and based upon that constitution, there would be elections. Lo and behold, there's a lot of jokes, right? A couple of Jews in a room, and lo and behold, people don't agree. They did not agree on what that constitution will hold. So eventually they came up with a compromise. It's called the Harari Compromise, which created this basic laws idea. And that reads that what will happen is the Knesset will become a parliament. It will pass basic laws. Those basic laws will in time be codified together to be a constitution, which will serve as a governing constitution. That wording opens a lot of questions. So at what point do they have constitutional power? Is every basic law a constitutional power? Does it hold constitutional power, or is it only at the end? Who knows? However, because politics is becoming more and more extreme, the chances that people are going to come together and say, you know what, but we can't agree on these basic principles is highly unlikely. One of the topics that's often debated to illustrate this is, right, there's seeming agreement across 85% of the Knesset, if we exclude what's called nominally the Arab parties, which is a definition I don't like, but that's what they're termed even in politics, or the Arab-Israeli parties. There's seeming agreement that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, at least that. Some parties are starting to drop the democratic, officially, but Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. So you think that a constitution may open with that. Well, who's a Jew? Are these parties going to agree? If you identify as Jewish, if you have had a reform conversion, if you are born Jewish, raised Jewish your entire life, but your mother apparently may not have been Jewish. So that's one of the most basic elements of the country, and that's often brought as an example of, like, you want to have a constitution, great, start there. Start there, let's see how far you get in figuring out what is going to be the overarching agenda of the country. Another example, just in brief, what are the country's borders? A constitution, first and foremost, defines where is the country's jurisdiction. Well, that's very questionable within these parties. Even until today, the more right-wing parties have not tried to include the Gaza Strip or the West Bank as part of the country. Right? Likud led the country with an iron fist for 12 years. Did not annex the West Bank, not annex settlements. The status quo of leaving this in question is very comfortable for that side. It's also very comfortable for elements on the left, because there is no real viable right now solution for a peace treaty. So it's very comfortable to just leave this as, we don't know. We shall see. It depends. Maybe one day. But that's why, short answer, yes, a constitution would help. Do I actually see Israel having a constitution? Maybe in my son's lifetime. He's 4 months old. Maybe. But not until then.
All right, let's do one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, I'm pretty loud. With Netanyahu, I have not heard. I know he's running, and he wants to be elected. Very much so. He's pushing his book all around. But where does he stand legally now? I haven't seen anything in the newspaper, or maybe I'm missing something.
So legally, he is under indictment in 3 different cases, what's called for reasons that the district attorney decided, case 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. He was also investigated in 3,000, but he was not indicted. Everyone around him was. But apparently he knew nothing. So he was not indicted, and he's currently in court. These are court cases, especially high-profile cases like this. In my opinion, let's say that everything stays as it is. I would not estimate that the court proceedings end before another 2 or 3 years. Just because. And until then, by law, you're innocent until proven guilty. So he's innocent, and the law does not stop someone who is under indictment from being prime minister. Stops them from being minister. Which means, by the way, because when you're prime minister, any portfolio, any ministerial portfolio that has not been allocated is yours automatically. However, when he was indicted in November of 2019, he had to resign from all the ministerial positions that he had because he could not technically still hold them, but he does not need to resign as prime minister. So that's his legal status.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Temple Beth Tikva, thank you for coming and spending Shabbat with us. Alon's email is on the next slide. If you want to go to the last slide. If anybody wants to be in touch, you can get
please do.
Day after election opinions here from Alon Burstein. Thank you. He will be officially living in Orange County at least for another year, hopefully a couple more. So thank you so much, Dr. Burstein, and you are always welcome here.
Thank you for having me. Not optimistic.
That's good. That's really interesting. Yeah. When you made the, they were so on top of it that when you made the calendar thing, everyone was.
Nice job.